Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website and remind all of our internet viewers now and in the future, you're welcome to send questions or comments to us at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. For those in-house, we would appreciate that courtesy check that our various mobile devices have been silenced as we prepare to begin. And while we're addressing technology, you may note that for today we happen to have a standing mic in the front of the room. Purely for technology issue questions, we need to have you come to the microphone in this case today. So when Alden gets ready to say, please speak into the microphone, he's also going to mean, please come up to the microphone, if you do not mind. Leading our discussion then today is Alden Abbott, who is Deputy Director of our Edwin Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. He also serves us as the John, Barbara, and Victoria Rumpel Senior Legal Fellow. Prior to joining us here, he served as Director of Patent and Antitrust Strategy for BlackBerry. He has also served as Director of Antitrust Policy for the FTC, Acting General Counsel of the Commerce Department, Chief Counsel for the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, and Senior Counsel in the Justice Department. He also serves as an adjunct professor at George Mason Law School and is a member of the leadership of the American Bar Association's Antitrust Section. Please join me in welcoming Alden Abbott. Alden?
Thank you very much, John, and welcome again, everyone, to the Heritage Foundation. The right to earn a living is a core human right and key to the pursuit of happiness. It has been recognized as having constitutional status by the Supreme Court. Yet in recent decades, states and localities have erected an increasing number of licensing requirements covering a wide variety of professions, which have made it more and more difficult for people to enter the American workforce and follow their dreams. What's worse, those rules often have borne heavily on the efforts of lower-income Americans to earn a living and start climbing the ladder of success. Today we have an all-star cast of experts to discuss the occupational licensing mess and what can be done to start fixing it. First, Maureen K. Ohlhausen, Acting Chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, will deliver opening remarks. She was sworn in as a Federal Trade Commissioner in April 2012 and designated to serve as acting FTC chairman by President Trump in January 2017. Before becoming a commissioner, she was a partner at the Wilkinson Barker Nauer law firm. Prior to that, she had enjoyed a highly successful career as an FTC official, including a stint as head of the Commission's Office of Policy Planning. Acting Chairman Ohlhausen clerked for D.C. Circuit Judge David Santel, and is an honors graduate of the University of Virginia and the George Mason, now the Scalia Law School. Let me add my personal observation that Commissioner Ohlhausen has done a terrific job as acting FTC chairman. She has taken a leadership role in advancing sound competition and consumer protection policy through advocacy here and abroad. She has worked with state officials, other federal agencies, and foreign enforcers to advance the cause of consumer welfare. Finally, she has brought carefully calibrated enforcement actions and launched important policy initiatives, one of which you will discuss today. Chairman Ohlhausen is no stranger to Heritage, having spoken eloquently in this auditorium on a variety of important topics, such as antitrust federalism and intellectual property protection. Today, she will discuss the nature of occupational licensing and explain how the Federal Trade Commission has been working with the states to pursue possible solutions to problems it poses. Following Acting Chairman Ohlhausen's remarks, a panel of experts will explore different aspects of the occupational licensing problem. First, Heritage Senior Legal Fellow Paul Larkin, who has written extensively on occupational licensing and public policy, will lead things off. He will be followed by George Mason University Economics Department Chair Professor Alex Tabarrok. Then we will hear from Washington, D.C. property management company employee Dexter Price Jr., who will present a real-life perspective on the problems posed by excessive occupational licensing. Next, we will take questions from the audience. And as John Hillbolt, our host, pointed out, you should come up to this microphone and line up when you're ready to ask questions. Chairman Ohlhausen, take it away, please.
Excellent. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks to Alden for that lovely introduction, and of course to Heritage for inviting me to speak here today. So this topic that I'm going to talk on is one of my favorites. The growing problem of unnecessary occupational licensing, and the part I really like is what we can do about it. I'll summarize some well-understood effects of licensure on competition. I'll explain the modern spread of unnecessary licensure and how it harms consumers, eliminates jobs, and slows the economy. And of course, I'll talk about how we at the FTC are addressing these problems through my Economic Liberty Task Force, which is actively advancing occupational licensing reform in cooperation with state and local governments. So first, how does occupational licensing affect competition? And this is an important question because the competitive process drives our economy. For all manners of goods and services, competition tends to benefit consumers by lowering prices, expanding access, improving quality, and driving innovation. So it's worth defending competition from various threats. And often in antitrust, we focus on how private conduct threatens competition. But excessive public restraints and overregulation can threaten competition too, and often in ways that are far-reaching and difficult to remove. Now, economists have long asked how occupational licenses affect competition, and we have some pretty strong answers. So centuries ago, Adam Smith observed that undue occupational restraints limited competition and were likely to shrink supply and misallocate labor. Modern theoretical and empirical work demonstrates that Smith's concerns were well-founded. Milton Friedman and Simon Kuznets did pioneering work in the 30s and 40s, analyzing income premiums associated with professional practice, including differences that reflect persistent hindrances to the free choice of occupation. Now today we would just call that entry barriers. George Stigler and Sam Peltzman provided key theoretical frameworks on the economics of regulation, with particular applications to licensure. And economists such as Morris Kleiner and Keith Leffler, Lawrence Shepard, Steve Salop, Deborah Haas-Wilson, Alan Kruger, Dick Carpenter, and others, that's a pretty long list, but even more, have empirically demonstrated the negative effects of licensure. And public choice scholars such as James Buchanan and Mancur Olson explained the incentives legislators and regulators might have to adopt economically harmful limits on economic liberty, such as unnecessary occupational licenses. And finally, as Alden has mentioned, the FTC and its staff have contributed to this work for more than 30 years through economic and policy studies of specific regulations and professions, such as nursing, optometrists, and vendors of optical goods, legal services, dental hygienists, and the real estate brokerage industry, among others. The practical takeaway from this body of work is clear. Although occupational licensing can have benefits, it often serves the interests of incumbents rather than the public. As such, unnecessary occupational licensing harms workers, consumers, and the economy as a whole. Now, for some occupations, licensure may be an appropriate policy response to specific consumer protection safety concerns. It can help mitigate the effects of certain potential market failures. For example, when there are persistent information asymmetries between professionals and consumers, particularly in highly technical fields, or where consumers can't easily observe service quality. So, for example, in certain healthcare occupations, consumers could face serious risks if treated by unqualified individuals, and yet consumers may find it difficult or impossible to assess the quality of care at the time of delivery. And in such circumstances, a license requirement may help improve public health and safety. However, much of the growth in licensing requirements has occurred in occupations where consumer risks are low or entirely speculative. So a good example is cosmetology. And that's why I've called my speech today, Death by 1,000 Haircuts. Although some licensing may be justified, some states require a year or more of education and significant fees for cosmetology. And one state requires 615 hours of education in cosmetology theory. A bad haircut or makeup application is pretty obvious to a consumer and to all of his or her friends. Now, bad haircuts and makeup quickly have consequences for the cosmetologist, and the consumer risk is often low or fleeting, but the excessive licensure requirement is not. It creates a large burden on those seeking to enter the workforce, and it limits competition. Now, interior designers, milk samplers, and many other vocations and professions have no clear rationale for licensure whatsoever, and the scope of the problem far exceeds these limited examples. Creative regulators have identified about 1,100 occupations on which to impose licensure requirements in at least one state, and the requirements for those licenses vary widely. Yet only about 60 occupations are licensed in all 50 states, meaning that for many of those 1,100 occupations, at least one state has found a mechanism sufficient to protect consumers. And even for professions where health and safety concerns or market failures may warrant some action, restrictions are often much broader than necessary to solve the problem. Other, less stringent alternatives, both public and private, can help consumers identify quality and value without creating high entry barriers. Now, unfortunately, in the past decades, regulators have too often defaulted to strict licensure. Now, indeed, occupational licensing has grown dramatically. In the 1950s, less than 5% of U.S. jobs needed a license. And today, that number is between 25 and 30%. And such licenses often require expensive, extensive education, years of on-the-job training, difficult examinations, and significant fees. And these burdensome requirements can close the door on job opportunities for people who are ready to work. They can prevent workers from marketing their skills to employers and consumers. And such requirements can reduce entrepreneurship and business innovation, insulating current service providers and legacy business models from new forms of competition. Now, one aspect of occupational licensing that harms many Americans, particularly those in military service and their families, is the lack of license portability. And workers, including military trailing spouses who move across state lines, typically need a new license and often face complex paperwork, expensive fees, and long delays. And because licensing requirements often vary by state, a new license might require additional coursework, training, or supervised experience, even for someone who was licensed and working in the field for many years. And taking a wider view, licensure disproportionately affects those seeking to move up the lower and middle rungs of the economic ladder. And they prevent people from developing and using their vocational skills to find employment, start a small business, or create a new business model. But the effects don't stop there. At the same time, licensing can drive up prices and reduce supply, which also harms lower and middle income individuals. So, for example, in 2000, the South Carolina legislature was concerned that many school children in low-income areas received too little dental care due to a scarcity of providers. And thus, they relaxed the restrictions on the provision of basic dental care, the screenings and cleanings, to increase access. And in response, the South Carolina Board of Dentistry enacted an emergency regulation that effectively reestablished the requirement that a dentist examine a patient before a hygienist could provide services. Now, the FTC brought in action alleging anti-competitive conduct on the part of the board, and I'm happy to say that in my previous role in the Office of Policy Planning, I helped develop that case and bring it forward. Now, the board asserted a state action immunity defense, but ultimately lost that argument in court because the board's action clearly subverted the legislature's intent to expand access, and then the case eventually settled. But the South Carolina case is a good example of how a self-interested regulatory board might impose occupational restrictions demanding a high level of care without demonstrating any countervailing health or safety justification for prohibiting a lower level of care. And such overly restrictive regulations create, for some consumers, the untenable choice between the gold-plated Cadillac care they can't afford and no care at all. Now, I've laid out the many granular problems with unnecessary licensing restrictions, whether applied to your barber or your dental hygienist. And while the burden of each individual regulation might be relatively small, in the aggregate, they form a substantial drag on American workers, consumers, and the economy, a proverbial death by 1,000 haircuts. So using standard economic techniques, one 2011 study estimates that license-related restrictions have resulted in as many as 2.85 million fewer jobs nationwide, with an annual cost to consumers of over $203 billion. Now, I've talked about the problem. Let me talk about potential solutions. In February of this year, as my first major initiative as the acting chairman, I formed the Economic Liberty Task Force to help shine a spotlight on the harms of unnecessary or overbroad occupational licensure, and to partner with state and leaders and other stakeholders to try to remove and reform these regulations. And the task force has done a lot in the past 5 months. We created a centralized resource, ftc.gov/econliberty, for licensing reform efforts. We've drawn significant media attention to the problem and its harmful effects on middle and low-income Americans and military families. And we've received a terrific response from a coalition of the willing, legislators and governors and other citizens and think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, who want to bring jobs and talents more widely to their states and cities and throughout the U.S. And furthermore, the task force has held dozens of meetings with outside parties to learn about the extent of the problem and potential solutions. And I'm particularly pleased to announce that tomorrow, the FTC's Economic Liberty Task Force will hold a roundtable focused on one of the specific problems I outlined earlier, the lack of license portability. And the roundtable will examine ways to reduce or eliminate the costs that state-based regulations impose on licensed workers when they move or seek to provide their services across state lines. And so we'll discuss, among other topics, various models that have emerged to enhance license portability and diminish the costs of multi-state licensing. Now, the task force is also planning a second roundtable to be held in the fall to consider and highlight new empirical research on occupational licensure. And these roundtables are an important part of the task force's ongoing efforts. Now, just to sum up near the end here, another part of the task force work is facilitating state-level reform efforts. And competition law reflects the important federalism structure of our government. And state officials may generally structure local markets to promote policy goals other than competition. But if a state chooses to displace competition, it needs to do so directly. And the Supreme Court recently affirmed this in the North Carolina dental case. But on the other hand, state legislators may choose to expand economic liberty and enact laws that promote free market competition. And the states are increasingly making this choice. And the FTC and the Economic Liberty Task Force is working with state officials, including governors, to move these kinds of reforms forward. And we're going to continue to do that. So in sum, unnecessary or overbroad occupational licensing requirements create harmful consequences for competition and consumers. And the growth of this licensure has been unchecked for too long. So I'm pleased to join with what I call the Coalition of the Willing to work to prevent or roll back unnecessary or overbroad licensing regimes and therefore promote free and competitive markets. So thank you for having me today, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Maureen. Chairman Ohlhausen, it's great to hear that the FTC continues aggressively to push forward on new initiatives to address the problem. We've heard about haircuts and makeup. Now I think we may hear something about dogs from our distinguished senior legal fellow, Paul Larkin. Paul?
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and thank you all for coming. You take time out of an otherwise busy day to come to Heritage to be educated and hopefully even entertained about some of the subjects that we talk about here. So I want to thank everyone who took time out today to come here and listen to this. I'm going to talk about two things. First, I'm going to give you an example of the intrusiveness of the nanny state, and why many occupational licensing rules are irrational, even silly. And then second, I'm going to talk about a reform that will take place not in the executive branch and not in independent agencies, but potentially through the legislature, that is through Congress, and that is the Allow Act. Recently, the New York Times and the New York Daily News each ran a story about New York City's efforts to prevent the use of dog-sitting apps such as Rover and Wag. Apparently, a municipal ordinance requires anyone who offers dog-sitting services to be licensed to run a kennel. The ordinance, therefore, effectively bars anyone from offering a dog-sitting service out of his or her home, or even out of the home of the owner of the dog. Apparently, even veterinarians would need to obtain a separate license in order to provide a dog-sitting service. By the way, New York City does not license babysitting at all. So keep that in mind. The city's Department of Health and Mental Hygiene believes this is a valuable addition to the armor necessary to protect the public against dangerous forms of new occupations. What that means is it apparently believes that the 44% of American households who already own a dog are incapable of taking care of a different one for a few days while the owner is out of town if the owner decides to pay for the trouble of dog sitting. That doesn't make very much sense to me. I doubt it makes very much sense to anybody in the panel, and I hope it doesn't make very much sense to anybody out there. If so, I leave it to the audience to decide whether the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene is aptly named. But dog lovers are not the only people who should be unleashed. I've made much worse jokes than that. Just ask anybody who's ever worked with me. You already heard about spouses of people in the military who effectively forfeit their license when they move to a new state following a reassignment of a service member. You will also hear later from Dexter Price, to my far left, who will tell you about an equally burdensome Washington, D.C. licensing rule. So if all you knew about were these problems, if the only thing you were aware of was the massive number of licensing requirements and the irrationality of the ones that exist, you might abandon hope that the world could ever be reformed. If so, I'm here to dissuade you. Reform is possible. Academics, scholars, government officials like Acting Chair Ohlhausen, and Supreme Court justices are starting to come around. Even President Barack Obama called for reform of a regulatory system that harms the public far more often than it helps anyone. And in the hope of spurring that sort of reform, 4 members of Congress last year introduced a bill called the Allow Act that would help in this regard. Last year, Senators Mike Lee and Ben Sasse, along with Representatives Mark Meadows and Dave Bratt, introduced separate but identical bills that would have addressed some of the problems of occupational licensing. Formerly known as the Alternatives to Licensing That Lower Obstacles to Work Acts, but better known by their acronym, the Allow Act, these bills would have taken positive steps in the direction of reforming the current unfortunate state of affairs. I discussed the Allow Act in detail in a legal paper that you can obtain in the corridor right outside the auditorium, so I won't go into detail here. But I would like to just summarize some of the benefits of it. Title I of the Allow Act would enable the spouse of a service member to travel from one state to another and use in the latter whatever, on a military base, whatever license that person was granted in the first state. So if a Marine were transferred from Quantico to North Carolina or someplace else, the spouse could bring whatever occupational license that person had in Virginia to wherever the new Marine base was located. Title II, in some ways the most important part of the bill, would effectively serve as a declaration of economic liberty in the District of Columbia. It would grant everyone the right to pursue any lawful occupation. In addition, it would also subject licensing schemes to far more rigorous judicial scrutiny than you normally see in the case of economic and social legislation. Like Title I, that would be a major improvement in the law. Finally, Title III would allow people to be paid for working as tour guides at federal battlefields and parks. It's difficult to see what harm there is from somebody working as a paid tour guide at a federal battlefield, since the only people who could be harmed on the field were the people who gave their lives in defense of the nation beforehand. But this too would eliminate that type of irrational restriction, and so it would make the law better. Those are small steps, but they are steps in the right direction. Properly tweaked, the Allow Act would improve the situation and help eliminate some of the obstacles that individuals face today in trying to make a living or even make a few additional bucks on the side. Now, can the Allow Act be improved? Yes, and let me give you a proposal that would improve it. The Defense Department trains soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in what are known as military occupational specialties. Consider medics and corpsmen. They receive the same life-saving skills necessary to become civilian emergency medical technicians or paramedics. If so, medics and corpsmen should not need to re-qualify in a new state when they leave the service if the military has already found them fully qualified to serve soldiers and the like on a battlefield. But that is only one example. There are probably others as well. So one hope I have is that Congress will consider, first, directing the Defense Department to examine all of the various types of training and skills that service members have and acquire, and second, authorizing the Defense Department, when appropriate, to issue a certificate of practice that would be valid in every state, so that a corpsman or medic who leaves the service can go from one state to another and not have to requalify in each one he or she goes to. The bottom line is this. Occupational licensing is one of those topics that proves Mae West was wrong. Too much of a good thing is not always wonderful. The licensing of surgeons makes sense. The licensing of dog sitters doesn't. Let's end irrational licensing schemes and improve the law, and in the process, help prove that Mr. Bumble was just as wrong as Mae West. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Now from dogs, I don't know, Professor Alex Tabrock, what animal he's going to discuss, but we'll soon find out.
Okay, so of course, being an economist, I want to start with Adam Smith. Adam Smith has a number of famous phrases. One of them is this, is that people of the same trade seldom get together except to conspire against the public, typically by raising prices. Now, this phrase is often trotted out in the context of antitrust law, which is fine, but actually, what Smith was talking about here was occupational licensing. What upset Smith was a 1563 statute of artificers in Great Britain, which said that anybody who wanted to practice in a skilled trade had to have a 7-year apprenticeship with a master. And then the tradespeople would get together in the towns and they would add to this so that a master could only have 1 or 2 apprentices at any given point in time. And as Smith pointed out, this was a restraint of trade which raised prices and harmed consumers. Now, in Smith's time, this statute was actually becoming less important over time because it had been cleverly interpreted to apply only to those professions which had existed in 1563 and not to all of the new professions which were arising due to the Industrial Revolution. And then Smith comes along in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations, and he launches a tremendous attack on occupational licensing. And in 1813, the statute is entirely repealed. Now, what I worry about today is that we are going in exactly the opposite direction to what happened during Smith's time. So today, since 1950, the extent of occupational licensing has increased by a factor of 5. Some 25 to 30% of the workforce now requires a government permit to work. And I should point out that most of this increase in the size of the workforce, which requires a license, most of this is not due to people entering licensed professions. It's due to an increase in the number of professions, the number of occupations, which require a government license. Now, occupational licensing, as Paul pointed out, it's irrational. There's many ways in which it simply doesn't make sense. So one of the ways is when you look across the states, it's bizarre how we regulate. So the Institute of Justice did a very good study of 102 licensed occupations where at least one state in a low or medium income occupation, at least one state had a license. But what they found is that for most of the licensed occupations, there are other states where there's no license required at all. So you have a really big, an odd diversity across the states if you think that these things are being driven by any a desire for safety or health or quality or something like that. Some states have it, other states don't. In addition, the burden which these licenses place on these occupations varies dramatically and in ways which make no sense. So manicurists are licensed in most states, but Alabama requires 163 days of education and experience to get the license, while Iowa requires only 9. Well, one of them's wrong. Right? In addition, take something like interior decorators. Okay? Mostly they're not licensed. But where they are licensed, the education and training requirements are higher than for emergency medical technicians. So the system doesn't make any sense. And more broadly, the biggest way in which occupational licensing doesn't make sense is that you would think that occupational licensing would be going away, not getting stronger. Why? Well, because the major reason why you might want occupational licensing, some type of asymmetric information, that is rapidly diminishing. Today we have services like Angie's List, we have Yelp, we have Amazon, all of these online services, such that it's easier than ever before to find out about the quality of service providers. So when I want to hire a plumber or a carpenter or somebody to work on my home, I always check Angie's List. Are they guaranteed? Do they have good reviews? I've never once looked, is this person licensed in some sense or not? Okay? So the asymmetric information is actually diminishing, and we should expect occupational licensing to be going away if it were based on rational reasons, not getting stronger. Now, what does occupational licensing do? So there's been lots of studies of this. What we find, economists find, first of all, it raises the wages of the people who are licensed. This likely comes at the expense of the people who are not licensed. So you reduce supply in the licensed profession, pushing up wages. The people who don't get in are pushed into other occupations, pushing wages down. It raises prices. From many different studies, we know that in general, occupational licensing does not increase quality, does not increase health, does not increase safety. In fact, occupational licensing can reduce quality, especially because of scope restrictions, which I'll explain in just a minute. One of the worst aspects of occupational licensing is that once one of these monopolies is created and a licensing board is created, it often becomes leveraged to become more powerful. So funeral directors, in many states, they are licensed, and where they are licensed, they have often leveraged their license so that only funeral directors can sell caskets. Now that's crazy. That's like saying that only auto mechanics can sell a car. It makes no sense whatsoever from any rational point of view. What it is, it's a leveraging of monopoly because of the licensing board. In the same way, physicians will typically oppose nurse practitioners. Lawyers oppose paralegals. In recent years, the American Dental Association has spent millions of dollars lobbying against the expansion of dental therapists. Now, in each of these cases, what this means is that quality can actually go down. So, for example, think about the legal profession. The excellent report on occupational licensing from the Obama White House pointed out that in California, for example, 90% of the people who go before an eviction proceeding don't have a lawyer. Why not? Well, one reason is that lawyers are really expensive. They would be much better served by a cheaper legal practitioner or paralegal. But that is illegal. You can't have somebody who's not a lawyer represent you before the court. So in each of these cases, physicians opposing nurse practitioners, lawyers and paralegals, dentists and dental therapists, you can actually get a reduction in quality. Because instead of going to the higher priced and maybe higher quality provider, people are forced to go without, to have no one representing them at all, not to get appropriate dental care, not to get appropriate health care. So occupational licensing, by pushing prices up and pushing consumers out of affordable alternatives, can actually reduce quality. Now, what do we do about this? Well, a couple of things. First of all, use voluntary certification and right to title. So I've already mentioned things like Angie's List or the Automotive Service Excellent certification, or something like the Chartered Financial Analyst. You can only call yourself a Chartered Financial Analyst if you have been certified by a particular group. I think that's okay. A right to title. Anybody can practice financial analyzing, but you can only call yourself a Chartered Financial Analyst if you have earned the title. I think that cost-benefit analysis should be required for every new license requirement. Sort of like the FTC does with lawyers and economists, do a cost-benefit analysis. Current licenses should be reviewed for scope and qualifications, making sure they're consistent with job requirements. We should review restrictions on felons and immigrants. Okay? Sometimes these are reasonable, oftentimes they're not. We want to do this not only to increase supply in the licensed occupations, but also to give people sometimes a second chance where it is deserved. Finally, and most importantly, licensing boards are really the linchpin of the entire system. And licensing boards should not be composed of professionals from the industry. Okay? We want independent licensing boards composed, let's say, of economists and lawyers, people like that, not professionals from the industry. Why don't we want licensing boards to be composed by professionals from the industry? Because people of the same trade seldom get together but to conspire against the public. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Professor Tabarrok, and also thanks for your really interesting suggestions. And next, Dexter Price Jr., who is a victim of irrational licensing restrictions in the District of Columbia, is going to tell us his story.
Good afternoon. My name is Dexter Price, and I want to first thank the Heritage Foundation for allowing me to speak today to you guys. I want to thank Maureen and Paul and Alex and Alden for allowing me to be a part of this discussion. I grew up in Washington, D.C., attended high school here, and met my high school sweetheart here, and we've been married 16 years. She's here today. The reason that I mention that is coming out of high school and being married right out of high school was tough. And one of the things that I needed was housing. And housing led me to a career in property management, and that's the license that I want to talk about today. Property management is not the selling or buying of real estate.